Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Charity Charge Nonprofit Spotlight Series, where we highlight the great work of the nonprofits that we come across and the people that are powering them behind the scenes. Today, I am joined by Dr. David Ruttenberg, who is the founder of Feebex, as well as a board member of the Florida Atlantic Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. Welcome, David. How are you today?
Matt, I'm great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to hang with you here and to hopefully contribute to your listeners and viewers. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, we really appreciate you and very excited to chat with you about your organizations, both Feebex and the center. Before doing that, really just curious about you and your background and what kind of set you on this path, what got you into the nonprofit sector and yeah, just where it all began for you.
Sure, I'll work backwards as engineers often do. I should introduce myself as a neuroscientist and an inventor who, at the tender age of 55, decided to go back for a PhD, specifically at University College London and University Cambridge, where I specialized in artificial intelligence ethics and some fascinating terminology called multimodal learning analytics, which is just techno speak, but specifically targeted towards neurodivergent individuals. You see, my work is deeply personal. It's inspired by my brilliant wife of 33 years, Susie, and our now 22-year-old daughter, Phoebe, for whom the company Feebex is named. Because we were later life parents, Phoebe was not once, twice, but three times diagnosed as a neurodivergent child with a stew of autism, epilepsy, and ADHD. And her reactivity to sensory sensitivity and her experience, particularly early on in classroom, eventually in employment, and certainly in social situations, helped me transform my previous life as a Grammy producer and one who operated in the music industry to eventually pursue scientific work to help engineer a solution for my kid around those distracting sensory cues that led to her anxiety, that led to fatigue and all those issues. And ultimately, what ended up happening is I produced something that worked for my kid and wanted to extend that into the not-for-profit space by helping others who I thought might be experiencing the same type of issues. So the doctorate allowed me to prove that up against very, very rigorous, and I do point my nose up when I say rigorous British science. And in so doing, that science was eventually operationalized into a wearable that the company Feebex, which I founded after Phoebe, to produce some type of device that would make sense for the wearer of the world around them, but also monitored how they reacted to that. And much the same way that these glasses bring into focus what I can see when they're on me, our wearables help bring into focus those things that would distract or otherwise make anxious or fatigue the wearer. It's
Mhm.
kind of like a Waze app for people's brains to help them guide them around those sensory time bombs and traffic that would otherwise cause them to be overwhelming in those situations and cause them to mask their authentic selves. So, how I got here was basically through my kid. I pivoted and I learned a lot to try to help her, and then figured out that just because it worked for my kid, everybody's got a brain that's like our thumbprints, so unique and different. So that's where the AI comes in to help personalize and make sense for each of the individual wearers. So I hope that
Yeah,
gives you kind of a background, and we can eventually
certainly.
dive into Florida Atlantic University and how
Yeah,
that helped branch out to a broader audience besides my kid and the hundreds of people
absolutely.
that I worked on clinical trials with. So
Yeah, no, that is very moving and personal and just really fascinating background and pivot that you made there. Can you talk a little bit more about what did work? I'm asking kind of how you got from point A to point B with Phoebe and what kind of light bulb moment for you was like I can apply this to other folks that this could work for as well.
I'll be happy to. So you'll remember part of the story was that formerly I was in the music industry And I'll never forget this. I mean, she's 22 now, but this happened when she was all maybe a little bit older than 2. I have a very small recording studio in our home that I would use to offset the expenses of going to the big cities and record it in there and do my editing downstairs rather than upstairs. So one day we're hanging out on the weekend and I'm playing something that I was working on for the Disney company. And our daughter's downstairs and she's bopping around, and my wife is encouraging her. And I think we had some other relatives over, and they said, "Oh, David, look, Phoebe's got your genes. She's going to be an engineer and a musician too." And I like, yeah, this doesn't look quite right to me because the music would stop, and Phoebe kept rocking out, and it was joyful. But then everybody went home, and Phoebe's still rocking out. There's no music. I'm like, okay, light bulb moment here. What's going on? And we noticed as she grew older, this type of self-stimulatory behavior for autistic people is not uncommon. In fact, it's not uncommon for non-autistic people to do things like twirl their hair or tap their fingers on a desk or their leg vibrated up and down or do this with a pencil, anything that soothes us for whatever particular moment. But we noticed with Phoebe that the way in which she was processing the world around her, both visually and auditorily, was completely different than anything else we'd ever seen. In fact, when we eventually got it tested, Phoebe's vision back then was predominantly peripheral. So if you think of those frogs whose eyes, or even a horse whose eyes are positioned this way, that was how our daughter was making sense of her world. And in order to figure out what was in front of her, she'd have to do this, which looks like she's rocking out, right? But the truth of the matter is, she's like turning her head this way to see what's in front of you, not only to identify who's in front of her, but also from a vestibular and balancing standpoint, right? So, what worked in that particular instance was something called prism lenses, which optometrists and ophthalmologists can prescribe for a variety of issues, not the least of which include autism, but traumatic brain injury and all these other sort of things. And in some instances, even for sports professionals, they provide these so that baseball players can track those 90-mile-an-hour plus baseballs coming in, which still
Mhm.
is phenomenal to me. But that was an aha moment because when I saw that happen and eventually her gain better control of not having to work so hard to just know that there was a teacher in front of her trying to talk to her, I realized that that was also happening with sound, the location of it, not just the loudness, not just the noise aspect of it, not just the frequency, but if there was a sound occurring at our daughter's 9 o'clock, I cannot tell you how many times she'd be engaged in something she liked, and this would happen. That head sway motion would occur, and it would immediately take her out of whatever it was that she was doing, a video game. But the same technologies that we use in making records to move sound around in a stereophonic field, I said, well, what if I could do that for those distracting sounds so that at least if I can't get rid of it, I can put it in front of her? And that worked just the same way that the prism lenses did. And at that point, well, we were off to the races because my kid became the co-designer, if you will. And we just said, okay, tell me all the things that makes you crazy, distracts you and anxious and fatigues you. And we just made a Chinese menu of those things, checked them off. And I said, okay, I'm going into the garage now. I'm going to start designing something for you. And 5 years later, she was using it at school and social situations at work, and nobody knew it was on her because it's about as obtrusive as these, not the big ski goggles that Apple and Meta and everybody's putting out there. That I mean, our kids show up looking different already. The last thing we need to do is strap a ski mask to their
Mhm.
head and say, "Go to school."
Mhm.
So that's pretty informative. I know that was a long answer, but I hope that helps at least personalize and let you know how passionate about this I am because it was my kid, right? And
Yeah,
if I could do that for others, that's all I wanted to do.
that's wonderful. Yeah, no, that was a perfect answer, and I appreciate the
Thank
background
you.
there. Did Yeah, and so did that obviously, you went on to found your company. Did obviously being a parent of a neurodivergent child and your dedication to her, did that kind of lead you to your work with the FAU Center for Autism
It
as well?
did. It did because initially, the university is one of 10 in our particular state that is a center of excellence where distressed parents go to meet other distressed parents and find best practices to try to help their particular family get through. And in our particular instance, we realized that, autism really is a spectrum. We have, you know, members of our particular community that are severely impacted, whose kids are our daughter's age and have never said the word mom or dad because their speech is so impacted by their difference. It doesn't mean that they can't think mom or dad or love mom and dad. It's just they're not able to vocalize that. So we initially went there as patients. Then, when it came time to determine whether or not there was science to the thing that I strapped on my kid, I went there no longer as a patient, but as a researcher to say, okay, could this work? Does this have legs um, for other people in the community? My remit here at Florida Atlantic University's card is just sort of 10,000 individuals, their caretakers, families, doctors, therapists, and whatnot, which brings it into the 20 and 30,000 person range, where we can find out, hey, existentially, is what's affecting Phoebe affecting other people? The answer is 90% of those on the spectrum have some form of sensory sensitivity.
Mhm.
And do they want any type of accommodation? And if they did, what would that look like? And if we were able to make it, would they be willing to test it to see if there's any efficacy? Does it work? And most importantly, would they tolerate it? So that's where the shift, yet another pivot occurred, because as I was determining this on an international scale at the universities that I was attending in the UK, I also wanted to bring it back home and say, okay, on this side of the pond, does anybody really even care about this? And it turned out the answer was yes. So we were able to get a very international flavor thanks to FAU card. And then it just blossomed because I went beyond the research and I wanted to say, okay, what other instances, particularly from a not for profit standpoint, away from my research,
Mhm.
could we help? Because sensory sensitivity is just one spoke on the wheel, if you will. And there were so many other issues that we really wanted to tackle. And we're ideally able to do so because of our location here in the Palm Beach, St. Lucie, Okeechobee
Mhm.
county areas, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, you have served on the board of you call it FAU card.
Mhm,
Appreciate that, and at one point was served as chairman of the board.
mhm.
Can you talk about your experience working on a board of a nonprofit? And yeah, just what surprised you about it? What did you learn? What have you learned from that experience?
Yeah, there were some key lessons and takeaways that we continue to scaffold as a result of these learned not-for-profit experiences. Specifically, here in Florida, you're familiar with Lake Okeechobee. The further you get away from the coast and the closer you get into the central part of the state, which is still part of our remit, our outreach there identified under-identified cases of autism in communities of color and communities of various languages that weren't necessarily Spanish or English, and certainly into lower middle incomes. And the key lesson that we took from that is that a cultural sensitivity is absolutely crucial for our not for profit. In those areas closer to the lake, there's tremendous mistrust in healthcare. There's tremendous stigma associated with having a neurodivergency or a delayed diagnosis for many families because so many of the practitioners there are also underinformed, and they would tell parents that their kids were either mentally incapacitated or less than, when in fact those were just misidentifications of diagnoses. We found that providing free, culturally responsive resources in the Creole language, for example, and with Creole materials really resonated with those families. And it significantly improved early identification, not only amongst the practitioners, but amongst their patients and their family engagement. And the key takeaway was that if we collaborated in a way that was resonant with the culture, and we then filled in those gaps between not only the families and their doctors, but other educators and practitioners, and focused on reducing those disparities by training, that's something that CARD would do. And it showed me how not for profits could drive systemic change by focusing on a community needs rather than just by their charter alone. The same thing with my own research. I got to be honest with you, the device I designed for my kid did not end up looking like the device and app that eventually Feebex released. And that's
Mhm.
because I had brilliant supervisors in London that said, hey, you're a wonderful American entrepreneur, but until you really meet with hundreds of people and determine those things that I talked about before about the existential need, whether or not they actually want something, what it would look like to them, not to
Mhm.
me, a neurotypical dad, but to them, then you start firing on signals. So we adapted that to the not-for-profit side and said, okay, look, we know that we're supposed to do this, but is that really in alignment with what the need is in the
Mhm.
community, especially when we get away from the big cities? And that was a huge takeaway to collaborate with those people on the ground and not necessarily from top down from our government centers, but rather bottom up from those in need. I hope that answers the question.
It very much does, and one thing that came to mind is the old, phrase, "Necessity is the mother of invention," which I think your answer, gives a new, perhaps literal meaning to.
To be
Um,
sure. To be sure.
I really do appreciate the insight there. A nonprofit should absolutely be sensitive to and really obtain a full understanding of the needs of the community that it's trying to serve, and finding the gaps like you mentioned when it comes to assembling a board, or just from either as a chairman or just a board member, being present for the selection of board members. Is that important to keep in mind when selecting board members that might have either connections to or are members of the society or the community rather that you're attempting to serve?
To be sure. It's almost like you've been reading our manifesto. I must congratulate you. Yeah, at least, and I'll speak about the not for profit, not Feebex, because we've plugged that enough at this point. But I will tell you that everybody who sits on the board at FAU Card either has a family member who has been diagnosed and has provided that potential board member years of lived experience. So it's not just somebody who wants to do well by being on a not for profit. And we appreciate that. But we find that they're more effective when they've stayed up at night and cried the tears as a parent that we do. And the other thing that we really prize ourselves on is that many of our board members are professionally diagnosed with the very condition. I don't call it a disability. I just call it a difference or a condition that we're trying to help. And because they've got direct lived experience, I mean, who better for them or better for the organization to have people who are actually living it from sun up to sundown every single day,
Mhm.
which is a little bit different because, when you're asking for resumes, you have to do so now very gingerly saying, okay, do you feel comfortable talking about your diagnosis? Can we confirm it with you? Can we confirm that your kid actually has it? And oftentimes that's really not an issue because so many of the people who serve on our board were at once time or another customers of Card, and we've worked directly with their pediatricians, or in the
Mhm.
case of the most buoyant segment that we assist now, it's later life diagnoses, people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that are finally getting the diagnosis that they've been craving because their entire life they thought it was something else. And imagine being relieved in your 50s or 60s to get an autism diagnosis. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, now I know why I'm the way I am. My brain's just wired a little bit differently. And
Yeah.
knowing that, I can make adjustments or request these things either in social, educational, or occupational contexts to have a richer life.
Wonderful. I appreciate that very much.
Likewise.
How can our listeners best support the work that you and Feebex and was it FEAU card?
FAU card, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. How can they best support you?
Thank you. I think the best thing anybody can do are two things. One, inform yourself, and I'll provide you with a link to some podcasts or blogs that I've been putting out lately, only because I think the truth is the most important thing to spread at this point, not misinformation. And then the second part is after you start to learn about these things, if it resonates with you and you want to support people for their difference, not their disability, but for their difference, join in the conversation. There are ways to do that without being political. There are ways to do that without being rude. There are ways just to, stand up for people whose differences you can't necessarily see because they're not in a wheelchair, they're not using a guide cane or a guide dog, or they're not wearing hearing aids or things like that. Just because they've got an invisible difference doesn't mean they don't deserve our respect and our desire to accommodate them. I just finished writing an op-ed that speaks to the absurdity of asking a person in a wheelchair to tough it out, get out of the wheelchair and start walking, or taking a guide cane away from a blind person and saying, you can do this. I mean, nobody in their right mind would do that, right? We have laws that allow for ramps and braille and these things in public places so that those people who have these visible differences can navigate and thrive and get through life. Yet we don't have anything like that for people whose brains are wired differently. And worse yet, our leaders are sometimes saying, well, it's not really a problem. It's caused by something else. And they just need to tough it out, which to me is just absurd. So the
Mhm.
short answer again to your question is what can we do? Educate yourself. And if it resonates and you feel you want to do something about it, speak up. That's it.
Excellent. David, we really appreciate your time and your insights, very valuable to us and our listeners. And we wish you the very best in all of your endeavors.
Likewise, I'm sure. And again, thank you a million for the opportunity. If anybody's got any questions, I'm sure we'll provide my contact information as well. I am here on this planet to do one thing: contribute. I'm not worried about money. I'm not worried about selling anything. All that stuff comes if you put contribution first. And to all the not for profits and the people out there supporting them, and Matt, you and your group for shining a light. We really appreciate you more than you know. Thank you so much.
Of course. And you take care, David.
You as well. Thanks.